The green bean casserole was still warm enough to fog the glass lid when the back of my sister-in-law's hand caught me across the cheekbone, right at my own dining room table, in front of both our mothers and a sheet cake that said Happy 10th in blue icing. "You don't serve yourself before I do, sweetheart," Whitney said, already reaching past me for the serving spoon like nothing had happened at all. I didn't cry. I didn't even flinch the second time, when she smiled down the table at my husband, and he looked at his plate like the tablecloth had suddenly gotten very interesting. "My name is Dana Kowalski. Prout, before I married into this family 11 years ago. This isn't really a story about a slap, even though that's where it starts. It's a confession, and it took me the better part of a decade to build the kind of calm I used against her that night. The calm that scared her a lot worse than crying ever would have. I grew up 2 hours north of Dayton, in a house where the good dishes came out twice a year, and my mother counted exact change into a coffee can labeled utilities. Grant grew up 40 minutes from where we live now, in a house with a boat in the driveway and a mother, Carol, who still says "we" when she talks about her late husband's construction company, like Ray is going to walk back in one day and correct the paperwork himself. I met Grant at 23, at a title closing of all places. He was buying his first house with cash his grandfather left him, and I was the closing agent double-checking his signature against his license. 11 years later, I'm still doing title work, 6 blocks from that same office, and he still can't sign his name the same way twice. We got married on a Saturday in August with $110 worth of gas station carnations, because that was what the florist had left over from a wedding the day before, and neither of us cared. Grant's family cared. Not out loud. The Kowalskis don't do anything out loud except laugh. But I learned early that there's a specific silence they use instead of an opinion, a silence with a shape to it, and I got a lot of practice standing inside it. Whitney is Grant's older sister, 4 years ahead of him. She married Chip Voss the summer before we got married, and Chip sells commercial real estate out of an office park off 675 with his name on a sign the size of a garage door. They live in a 5-bedroom in a subdivision called Foxcroft Reserve, the kind of neighborhood where the mailboxes all match and somebody's HO newsletter uses the word curated without a hint of irony. Whitney redid her kitchen twice in 9 years. I know because she posted the demo day both times, hard hat and all, captioned with a Bible verse about blessings. For most of those 11 years, I told myself the money didn't bother me. It mostly didn't. What bothered me was smaller and stupider than money. It was the way Whitney handed me my coffee at Thanksgiving, in the one mug in that whole cabinet with a chip in it, every single year, like the house had exactly one damaged mug, and it was mine by some law of physics. It was the way she introduced me to her friends as Grant's wife. "What is it you do again, hun?" After knowing my job title for a decade, small things, splinters, not knives, I told myself splinters don't need a doctor. There was a cottage once, up on Indian Lake, that belonged to their grandfather. Everybody just called him Pop. 3 bedrooms, brown shag carpet nobody ever got around to replacing, a dock that needed new boards every spring. When Pop died, the plan, as I understood it from Grant, was that the cottage would go 3 ways. To Grant, to Whitney, and to their brother Denny, who lives out in Tucson and flies back maybe twice a year. I wasn't in those family conversations. I was 7 months pregnant with our daughter the year it happened, and mostly what I remember is Grant coming home from a meeting at his mother's kitchen table, looking relieved instead of sad, saying Whitney had it handled. She was good at that kind of thing, paperwork and lawyers and forms, and none of the rest of them wanted to deal with it themselves. I remember thinking, even then, half asleep on the couch with my feet up on a laundry basket, somebody in this family is always the one who has it handled. It's never Whitney's job to carry the plates back to the kitchen. It's always her job to hold the pen. I didn't think about the cottage again for 6 years. Why would I had a kid starting kindergarten, a job that ran 45 closings a month during the refinance booms, and a husband who worked overtime installing HVAC systems in July heat so we could put a new roof on our own place. Which is a nice way of saying our place is nice, but it isn't Foxcroft Reserve. I'd stopped keeping score on that particular splinter a long time before this story really starts. What I didn't know yet, what none of us knew yet, was that having it handled had a very specific, very legal meaning, and that meaning was sitting in a courthouse basement the whole time, waiting for somebody in the family who actually knew how to read it. The anniversary dinner was my idea, which in hindsight is its own kind of joke. 10 years felt like something worth doing properly, so I hosted it myself instead of letting Carol take it over the way she takes over everything. I made a pork roast, green beans with the bacon Carol always uses so nobody could say I'd skipped a step, and a sheet cake I picked up from the Kroger on Wilmington Pike, because I'm a title agent, not a baker, and I made my peace with that fact a long time ago. 8 of us sat down at 6:45 on a Saturday that was still 91 degrees at 7 o'clock. Me, Grant, our daughter, Carol, Whitney, Chip, Denny in for the weekend from Tucson, and my own mother, who almost never comes to these things and had, for reasons I still don't fully understand, decided this was the year to show up. Everything was fine for exactly 9 minutes. Then Carol's green bean casserole came around the table. Her recipe, her dish, but I'd made it, because Carol's knees have been bad since spring and I'd told her to just sit. And I reached over and served myself a spoonful before passing it on down toward Whitney's end. "You don't serve yourself before I do, sweetheart," Whitney said, flat, almost gentle if you didn't know her. The way you'd correct a child reaching toward a hot pan. And then her hand came across the table and caught me on the cheekbone, quick, open-palmed, more shock than force, gone before I'd even fully registered the sound of it, which was smaller and cheaper sounding than I would have guessed. 10 years of never once imagining what a moment like that might actually feel like, and it turned out to sound like nothing much at all. Like a dish towel snapping. Nobody moved. My daughter's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. My own mother's face did something I had never once seen it do before, a kind of controlled collapse. Chip stared very hard at his beer. Denny said "wit" and didn't finish it, and Grant, my husband on our own anniversary at our own table, looked down at his plate like the tablecloth had suddenly become the single most interesting object in Montgomery County and said nothing at all. Not stop. Not what the hell. Not even my name. It wasn't the sting that surprised me. It wasn't even the fact that she'd done it in front of both our mothers and a 7-year-old. It was how bored she sounded doing it. Like this was a chore she'd been putting off, like correcting me was somewhere on a list between the dry cleaning and the orthodontist. I felt my face go hot, and then, underneath that, something went very still and very cold, in a way I didn't recognize yet and would come to recognize a great deal better before that night was over. I remember thinking, with total clarity, in my own voice and nobody else's, I am not going to be the loud one. I had spent 11 years watching Whitney win every room she walked into by being the loudest, most certain person in it, and some old, stubborn, accountant's daughter part of me decided in that exact second that I was not going to hand her that room too. "Pass the rolls," I said to Denny, and my voice came out so level that Carol actually laughed. A short, nervous bark of a laugh, the kind that comes out of a body that doesn't know what else to do with itself. Whitney looked almost disappointed. I think she wanted the tears. I think Whitney has always wanted the tears, from everybody, for as long as I've known her, and it's the one thing about that dinner I understood immediately and completely. My not crying was going to cost her a great deal more than my crying ever would have. What she didn't know, what nobody at that table knew except me, was that I hadn't come to that dinner empty-handed. Not empty-handed the way people usually mean it, with a store-bought cake and a card. I mean I had walked into my own house that night, on my own 10th anniversary, carrying something in my bag that had been sitting there, folded into a plain manila folder, for exactly 16 months and 4 days. I hadn't planned on using it that night. I want to be honest about that part, because the honest part isn't flattering. Some small, tired, splinter-collecting piece of me had just been carrying it everywhere for over a year. The way you carry a knife you tell yourself is only for emergencies, because some nights you don't trust the dark enough to leave it home. To understand why my hands didn't shake when I finally reached for that bag, you have to go back 16 months, to a Tuesday afternoon at Buckeye Title that I almost didn't work late for. I understand now that if I'd left the office 5 minutes earlier that day, the way I nearly did, none of what happened at that dinner table would have happened the way it did. Whitney might have gone right on correcting me in front of my own daughter for another 10 years, but I didn't leave 5 minutes earlier. I stayed because a file on my desk had a name on it that stopped me cold, and once I started pulling that thread, I couldn't make myself stop. The file wasn't even mine. I want to say that plainly because later somebody, Whitney's lawyer actually, months after all of this, Tried to make it sound like I'd gone digging through her business on purpose, like I'd broken into a locked drawer somewhere. I hadn't. I was covering for a coworker named Pam who'd gone home sick with a migraine, running a title search on a completely unrelated refinance 3 streets over from Indian Lake, and the recorder's index pulled up a name I knew. Kowalski, attached to a parcel number I also knew because Grant had mentioned it exactly once, years earlier, half asleep on our own couch. Cottage, Pop's cottage. I remember it was 4:50 on a Tuesday, because I remember thinking I had 10 minutes to either close the window on my screen and go pick up our daughter from aftercare, or open the document and be late. I opened it. That's $40 in aftercare late fees I've never once regretted paying. It was a quitclaim deed, 6 years old by then, transferring Pop's cottage on Indian Lake free and clear to Whitney and Chip Voss, signed, supposedly, by their father Ray and by Denny, notarized on a Thursday in March by a notary whose commission, according to that same county's own public records, had already lapsed the previous December. I sat there in an empty office with the air conditioning ticking and read that date 4 times, because in my job, a lapsed commission on a notarization isn't nothing. It isn't proof of anything either, not by itself. I want to be careful about that, because I was careful about it for a year and a half. But it's the kind of thing that makes you keep reading. So I kept reading. 2 folders deeper into that same parcel's history, I found the sale. The Vosses had sold Pop's cottage 11 months after that deed was recorded for $192,000, cash close, no financing contingency. 11 months after that sale, county records showed a new mortgage recorded on a 5-bedroom house in a subdivision called Foxcroft Reserve. I didn't need a calculator to do that math. I did it anyway twice, standing at my own kitchen counter that night with the lights off so Grant wouldn't come downstairs and ask what I was looking at. I didn't tell Grant that night. I told myself it was because I needed to be sure first, and that part was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth is that some small, ugly corner of me was scared of what I'd find if I watched his face while I said the word, forged, out loud in our kitchen. Scared he already knew, and just as scared that he didn't, and that I'd be the one who had to hand him that particular grief on a Tuesday night in September. So I made copies instead. On my lunch break, on my own printer paper, using nobody's login but mine, because everything I'd looked at was open to the public anyway. That's the whole point of a recorder's office. Anybody can walk in and pull a deed. I just never had a reason to want to. I folded the copies into a plain manila folder, and I put that folder in the drawer under our silverware, behind the extra placemats we never use, and for about 6 weeks that drawer was the loudest thing in our house. I'd stand at the sink doing dishes and feel it behind me like a held breath. I ate a lot of crackers that fall, standing up over the sink at 11 at night, telling myself it was because I wasn't hungry at dinner. I was hungry at dinner. I just couldn't make myself sit down at our table and look at Grant across it. Not yet, not with that folder 6 feet away under the forks. What I didn't do for a long time was anything at all. I told myself I was gathering more information, and some of that was true. Twice that winter I drove out to the county recorder's office on my actual lunch hour, not through work, just as myself, and pulled the underlying probate file from when Pop died. The one that was supposed to show 3 signatures agreeing to however the estate got split, Grant's and Whitney's and Denny's. Grant's was there. Whitney's was there. The line where Denny's should have been just had his name typed underneath a signature that didn't look anything like the one on his old high school yearbook, which I know sounds like a strange thing to compare. But Denny had signed my copy of that yearbook back when he and Grant and I still hung out as friends, before Grant and I were even dating, and I'd kept it. Some nights that fall, I actually got that yearbook down off the shelf and set it next to the copy in my folder, like I was building a case in a courtroom nobody had called me into. The final piece landed by accident, the way the whole thing had started. It was Denny's birthday, the following June, and we were all at Carol's for cake, and Denny mentioned, completely offhand, reaching for a second slice, that he'd missed Pop's funeral reception because he'd been stuck at a work conference in Phoenix that whole week and couldn't get a flight out in time. I remember exactly where I was standing, by the sliding door, when he said it, because I did the math without meaning to. The quitclaim deed said he'd signed it in person, in Ohio, in front of a notary, on a Thursday during that same week in March. He wasn't in Ohio that Thursday. He was in a conference room in Arizona. He'd told me that himself, for free over cake, 6 years after the fact, with absolutely no idea what he just handed me. I didn't say anything. I went home and sat in my car in our own driveway for 20 minutes before I could make myself go inside, because I understood, finally, all the way down, that this wasn't a paperwork mix-up anymore. Somebody had forged Denny's signature. Somebody had forged it, most likely, on their own father's kitchen table, in a house Ray still lived in at the time, and used it to walk away with the only thing their grandfather had left behind that wasn't already carved up by taxes and a bad business year. Then used the money from selling it as the down payment on a house with a 3-car garage and a sign out front that says Foxcroft Reserve in wrought iron script. I'm not proud of what I felt standing at that sliding door. Everybody assumes, when I tell this part, that I felt sick or sad or betrayed on Denny's behalf, and I did feel all of that eventually. But the very first thing I felt, before any of the decent feelings caught up, was something closer to relief. The specific relief of finally having proof for a feeling I'd been talked out of for 11 years. I'm not going to pretend that's a flattering thing to admit. It's just the true one. For the better part of a year after that, I sat on it. I went to Thanksgiving. I went to Easter. I watched Whitney redo that kitchen a second time and post the demo day with the same hard hat and the same Bible verse, and I smiled and said it looked great, because it did look great. That was never the problem. I told myself I was waiting for the right time, or waiting to talk to a lawyer properly instead of reading statutes on my lunch break like they were a hobby, or waiting for Denny to bring it up himself so it wouldn't have to be me. Looking back, I think I was mostly just waiting to see if I actually had it in me to blow up my husband's family on purpose, or whether I was going to be one more person in that house who decided a folder in a drawer was easier than a fight at the table. So that's what was sitting in my bag on our 10th anniversary, folded into that same manila folder, when my sister-in-law's hand crossed my face over a spoonful of green beans, and my husband studied his own dinner plate like it might apologize for him if he stared at it long enough. I want to tell you I'd planned it that way, that I'd walked into that dinner already deciding this would be the night. I hadn't. I'd only brought the folder because 2 days earlier I'd finally worked up the nerve to make a copy for Denny, and I hadn't found the right moment yet to hand it to him quietly, away from everyone else, the way I'd always imagined doing it. But sitting there with my cheek still warm and Whitney reaching for the serving spoon like she'd already moved on, something in me finished deciding. 16 months and 4 days of crackers over the sink, of yearbooks pulled down off shelves at midnight, of watching a woman build a whole beautiful life on somebody else's signature. All of it arrived at that table at the exact same moment I did. I reached down for my bag. I didn't throw anything. I didn't raise my voice. I unzipped the outside pocket, slow enough that Carol actually stopped mid-bite to watch me do it, and I set the manila folder on the table between the casserole and the sheet cake that said Happy 10th in blue icing, and I opened it flat, the way you'd lay out a hand of cards you already know is a winning one. My hands didn't shake once. I noted that the way you'd note the weather outside a window, a fact, nothing more. I was still not going to be the loud one. This is a copy of a quitclaim deed for Pop's cottage, I said, to the whole table, in the same level voice I'd used 2 minutes earlier to ask Denny to pass the rolls. It's dated the 8th of March, 6 years ago. It's notarized by a woman whose commission had already expired the December before, and it has Denny's signature on it. Denny, even though you told all of us, not 2 months ago, at your own birthday, that you were at a conference in Phoenix that entire week and never made it back for the funeral reception. I have the notary's public license record. I have the sale from 6 years ago. $192,000 wired the same month your mortgage on this house closed. For a second, nobody said anything at all. Then Denny reached across the table, slowly, and turned the folder around to face himself, and I watched a grown man look at his own name written in handwriting that wasn't his, on a page he'd never signed, for the very first time in his life. This isn't about a green bean casserole, I said, before anybody could fill the silence for me. It isn't even about you slapping me tonight, in my own house, in front of my daughter. This is about a piece of paper somebody forged in your father's kitchen 6 years ago, and a house some of you are sitting in right now that got built on it. Whitney's face did something I'd been picturing, on and off, for 16 months, and it wasn't what I expected. I'd pictured tears, or screaming, or her flipping the table the way she used to flip Monopoly boards as a kid, according to Grant. What actually happened was smaller and worse for her. She went very quiet and very pale and said, "That's." Denny knew about that, we talked about it, he agreed, and Denny cut her off with a single word, flat as a dropped plate. "No, just that, no." Chip didn't say anything at all. He picked up his beer, looked at the label like it might have new information on it, and set it back down without drinking. Grant finally looked up from his plate. "Dana, this isn't the time," he said, and something in me that had been holding very still for 16 months finally let go, quietly, without raising its voice. "You've had 6 years to decide when the time was, Grant," I said. "You knew Whitney handled the cottage paperwork. You told me yourself she was good at that kind of thing. You've spent this whole marriage deciding it wasn't your business to ask her a single follow-up question, the same way you just decided, 20 minutes ago, that it wasn't your business to say a word when your sister hit your wife at your own table. Both of those were you choosing not to know something, on purpose, and tonight they both landed on this table at the exact same time." He didn't have an answer for that. I watched him not have one, in real time, in front of his whole family, and I want to be honest. Some small, unlovely part of me had been waiting a long time to watch that particular silence land on him instead of me. I'm not proud of that either. I'm just telling you the truth. The rest of that night doesn't make for a very cinematic ending, and I've come to think that's the most honest part of the whole story. Nobody got arrested at the table. Nobody got disowned on the spot. My daughter went and got the sheet cake out of the fridge because she was 7 and she genuinely just wanted cake, and somehow that broke the worst of the silence better than anything any of the adults could have said. Denny left 40 minutes later without finishing his coffee. He called me 2 days after that, not Grant me. And we talked for an hour and 10 minutes, and somewhere in there he said something I still think about. That he'd always figured the cottage sale was just one more thing the family handled without him because he lived so far away, and it had never once occurred to him that handled without him and handled instead of him could be 2 completely different sentences. Whitney and Chip hired a lawyer of their own within the week, which I understand. I'm not going to sit here and walk you through the exact legal machinery of what happened after that, partly because I'm not a lawyer and partly because most of it simply isn't mine to tell. What I can tell you is that by the following spring, Denny had an agreement in writing that made this right in the way paper actually can, and that Whitney and Chip's 5-bedroom in Foxcroft Reserve went up for sale 11 months later, with a sign that said price REDUCED sitting under the FOR sale 1, and I never once heard Whitney bring up my chipped coffee mug again. Carol didn't speak to me for 4 months. I want to say that plainly too, because it would be easy to tell this story like everybody on Whitney's side turned on her instantly, and I stood in the wreckage looking noble, and that isn't what happened. Carol believed her daughter for a long time, longer than the documents gave her any real reason to, because that's what mothers do, and I don't actually hold that against her the way I once thought I would. What I do hold on to is the Christmas card that showed up in our mailbox that December, 4 months into the silence. No letter, no big speech, just her handwriting on the front, Dana and Grant and the baby, and inside, under Merry Christmas, 1 line, "I should have asked more questions a long time before you had to." It wasn't an apology exactly. It wasn't nothing either. Whitney has never apologized to me. Not once, not for the slap and not for the deed, and looking back, I don't think she ever will, and somewhere in the last 2 years I stopped needing her too. That's not forgiveness. I want to be clear about that, because people always want the ending to be forgiveness, and it isn't. It's just that I ran out of room in my life to keep waiting on something that was never coming. Grant and I are still married. We did 6 months of counseling that started out mostly about that one dinner and ended up being about 11 years of things neither of us had ever said out loud. And I won't pretend that's fully finished, because I don't think that kind of thing ever fully finishes. But he asks follow-up questions now. Actual ones. Last month his mother mentioned, in passing, that she was thinking about redoing her will, and I watched him ask her 3 questions about it at the kitchen table before I'd even opened my mouth, and I didn't say anything. I just got up and put the kettle on, because some wins don't need a witness. The cottage is gone. Somebody else's family cooks out on that dock now, and I don't know their names and I don't need to. What we have instead is smaller. A house that isn't in Foxcroft Reserve, a mug shelf in our own kitchen where every single mug matches because I bought them myself, on sale, at the Major on Miller Lane, and a daughter who's 9 now and still asks, some Sundays, if we're driving up to Aunt Whitney's, and we tell her not this year. And she shrugs and goes back to her cereal, because 9-year-olds have a mercy about them that the rest of us lose somewhere along the way. Last Tuesday, I stood at that same sink, doing dishes, and I realized I hadn't thought about that folder in months. It isn't in the drawer anymore. I gave the original back to Denny a long time ago. What's left under our silverware now is just silverware. So here's what I actually want to know, and I mean this, not as a rhetorical thing to close out a video. How long did you sit on something you already knew because saying it out loud felt bigger than the piece it would cost you? I sat on mine for 16 months and 4 days, and I've come to believe that number is different for everyone, but almost everybody listening to this has one. If you've got yours, I'd genuinely like to hear it. Put it in the comments, or send this to the one person in your life who's standing at their own sink tonight, eating crackers, trying to decide if this is the night. We want to hear your stories down in the comments. And if Dana's confession resonated with you today, don't leave without hitting that subscribe button. Here at Casterly Payback, we bring you stories that matter, stories that aren't just generated, but felt. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and we'll see you in the next one.